Councilmember Anderson.
No questions.
For me, it was, I was just curious, the increase went from 90,000 for the total to 111,000, but the material cost is 18%. That increase is more than 18%. Was there another, plus we took part of the steep road off of it, so.
So was the product cost going from
91 cents to
92 cents a gallon, I think, to $1.09.
Right, so it was an 18% increase in cost, but the increase in the project went up by more than that. 18% increase in project would have been $106,000. I was just curious why, if we took some road off of it, why it wouldn't be less than that.
Devin, are you listening to this conversation right now? Chad?
Yes, I think the cost went up in the low, like 22% on a per gallon basis, but when you factor in taking off the road, the quantity adjustment then drops the overall increase on the 18% as a project percentage.
Okay, so my real question is the increase in cost was material cost?
Well, that you want to know that percentage of the material cost increase?
No, I was just curious that if the cost of the project went up because of material cost increases and that increased by 18%, why did the whole overall project go up by 20-some%?
Because the material cost went up by more than 18%. It was like 22%.
Okay, that answers it.
Well, I want to confirm that, because I think it was 92 cents a gallon, and then it went to $1.09 a gallon, and that increase from $1.92 to $1.09 is 18%.
Yeah.
I do know with last year, we had much better data using last year's actual gallons that we actually used. So we copied the gallons we used last year, less Kevin's math on what half mile speed roads is.
Okay.
So I think we're more accurate this year.
Okay, I guess I'm just, if you just look at the raw numbers of what the statement is.
But the 18% came from changing from 92 cents a gallon to $1.09 a gallon. So we'll follow up on that.
Yeah, I'm just, okay, what was the last one on that? Councilmember Schultz, comments?
Yeah, so I'm wondering why we can't continue to spend based on 2020 budget and consider buying the same quantity or same amount, or not the same amount in quantity, but basing our spend based on the dollars and then just looking at where we do not need to put application or can put reduced application. There's some roads where the density of homes is pretty spread out, and do we need to continue to apply the full length of the road, or can we do like there's one section of Meister Road where we're doing 400 feet centered on the home. And some of these larger roads where they're less dense, could we look at just doing that in those areas as well and cut down on the use of product?
Kevin, can you talk about that? And we'll clarify before Kevin speaks that one on Meister Road, that's one of those where the individual pays by themselves for the whole amount and is not subsidized. But Kevin, you want to talk about the opportunity to reduce the cost of the project by having reduced application in areas? I think Pat would not like to do that, of course, we'll let you explain.
Yeah, I mean, that's an option that staff considered, and it's one that we don't recommend primarily because we found what we believe is in terms of concentration on the roads. So if you dial back that solution, your performance drops, and we just felt like if we were going to go through with the project, we didn't really want to see a performance drop.
You're talking about performance drop and the stability of the road in those areas where it's applied, correct?
Yeah, just, basically the value you're getting when you put down, it brings you out of that sweet spot.
So is it possible in areas we just don't apply the product?
Yeah, I mean, we could select the road and, we'd have to, pull that out of the revenue a little, so we have to kind of do a circular, pull something out. It could change the assessment.
Well, we're basing it.
If there's a road that, I'd have to check with Pat if there was one felt like, maybe could be removed, we could see that, but the likelihood of matching it up perfectly with the budget would be fairly challenging, but we could look at that.
The assessment's based on the per unit property, right, on the road? It's not based on the linear frontage of the road that property has. I thought it was a per unit assessment.
Correct, it's per unit, exactly. And I guess as far as we as staff, certainly if you said we're at $11,600 over budget is unacceptable, bring us a way to meet budget, we would do that. And we can bring you some options to do it. Per our discussion, as Kevin mentioned, we're concerned about the sweet spot we found and moving forward, just keep our roads in good, stable condition. But rather than maybe going into the semantics of how we can get down there, if there is support for the council saying you can't go over like the budget grant, we can still call the public hearing and then bring you options and have that meeting for ways to meet that objective.
Yeah, I'd prefer to stay within the budget, to be honest with you.
Well, those are separate items as far as what we've been doing tonight is calling a public hearing, so we can give direction to staff on the budget issue separately, right?
Okay.
I would like to hear it tonight if that's.
Yeah, we should, we'll act on it tonight, but if there's a desire to, which would be led by Councilmember Schultz. But they're two separate items. So we can do the public hearing without committing to the budget, and then address the budget after that. Okay, Councilmember DeJuice, you with you, Alan?
I was gonna ask, when would this public hearing be held? When do you see it next on our agenda?
May 28th.
May 20th. All right, thank you.
Okay, Councilmember DeJuice?
I really have no comment on it. I'm fine with it.
Okay. Okay, so we'll take two action items here. One is I entertain a motion to approve resolution 2020-28, which is calling a public hearing for May 28th for the assessment.
So moved. Dejewski.
Second, Schultz.
Any further discussion? All in favor, signify by saying aye. Thomas, aye. Anderson,
Aye.
Bottom,
Aye.
DeJuski,
Aye.
Schultz.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Alan, you wanted to, I guess, if we want to move on this, I would suggest we move forward with a motion and then have a discussion on the issue as far as the budget.
Yeah, I would like to make a motion that we stay within the 2020 budget and look at ways to either change how we're applying or take sections of roads off or something to stay within budget.
Or increase the assessment, I suppose, would be another option.
Yeah, I mean, that's an option, but if we're assessing based on the property unit along the road and not by frontage, then I don't see how changing someone's value for the assessment would change whether you do 400 feet on each side of their home or you do the whole section down the road for them.
Okay, I'm sorry, Alan, I asked you for a motion, and I put it in and screwed up her ability to do the motion. Let's start over again. If you want to put forward a motion.
I want to put forth a motion to stay within the 2020 budget and direct staff to provide options to do so.
Do we have a second? Okay, hearing no second, I guess the motion dies for lack of a second. Okay, I'll move on to item 10C, which is the Employee Mental Wellness Program.
And I've asked Max to present that item.
All right, thank you, Mayor and Council. This is a multifaceted issue, kind of a multifaceted response proposed. Over the past several years, the impact of employee mental health on organizations has been really scrutinized in across the business world and across government. The impact of employee mental health support is not limited to just suicide prevention, but also workplace productivity and culture. They've shown unhealthy coping mechanisms and inability to effectively confront the issues can lead to negative implications in the workplace, like poor performance, absenteeism, and interpersonal conflict. And some of those are outlined in the CDC handout that was in your packet. And on a law enforcement note, the lack of support for employee mental health has been highlighted in the law enforcement community during the past year with the suicides of multiple police officers across the state, including in one of our neighboring communities. Obviously, suicide isn't just a law enforcement issue, but it does manifest itself at a higher rate in this profession, more so than others. But in bringing these issues to light, it was also discovered there was a severe lack of people qualified to address the unique stressors faced by law enforcement professionals, and really the ability for officers to find help in places when and how they needed it. So in looking into that with law enforcement, the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association and several other areas in the profession have undertaken initiatives to train law enforcement executives and people in the profession to really educate leaders on best practices. And they've taken cross-disciplinary approaches with mental health providers and law enforcement professionals. And one of the biggest things they developed was looking at regularly having annual mental health check-ins for police officers that were mandatory. And what that really did is provide an avenue that the officer would be required to just sit down with a person who's trained to talk through some of those issues with them and really provide the opportunity for some self-examination that a lot of us wouldn't necessarily take otherwise. And that was found to be helpful in the law enforcement community, statistically speaking, that some issues that would have gone unaddressed were brought to light at that point. And the level of participation in those varies from officer to officer. Some chose not to actively participate, but other ones really did once they were given that opportunity. So it has proven valuable in the communities that have implemented the mandatory check-ins. Also, there's been talk about making those check-ins mandated legislatively. That was talked about a little bit at the Capitol this year, and I think that's something that wouldn't surprise me within the next several years to start seeing that as a best practice. In addition to the law enforcement check-ins, we've also identified a significant gap in service for our staff members, not just police officers, but also city staff, in addressing employee mental health. So currently our city has an employee assistance program, or EAP, and we've found with more than a handful of employees that was incredibly ineffective, and actually the ones reporting back said that they were more frustrated and put off by the EAP program than going down other avenues. And that's really not unique to health partners. We had a similar experience when we were with Blue Cross and Blue Shield as an insurance provider. And really the EAP is designed to help guide people to the correct service, which proved unsuccessful in the past. After the EAP, the next avenue for employees currently is to look within the network to find a provider. It's challenging for people not in law enforcement. It's extra challenging for people in law enforcement. Finding people that have the appropriate credentials and training and the ability to effectively treat law enforcement. They've shown that it's really different working with law enforcement officers than it is the general public. It's not to say it's better or worse, it's just different, and there's some unique things to handle there. And even many of the private providers, it really comes down to, they also sometimes don't know what they don't know, in believing they might be equipped to help and be well-intentioned, but finding out once they get down the road that they're maybe not equipped to handle some of those, some of the things that they're faced with. So one of the things that we're hoping to look at as a city is really trying to address that gap to really, to really address the gap in short-term care that we have for our employees, or the lack of short-term issues that precipitate the need for short-term mental health support or singular professional or life events that don't require long-term therapeutic treatment. So currently where officers or staff members would try and find that long-term care provider, that wouldn't necessarily change, but one of the biggest issues is that in order to receive support through health insurance, you have to have a mental health diagnosis. And where that becomes complicated is, for instance, an officer, we'll use a police officer for example, is working through a critical incident, and they might not have significant long-term impact, but they're trying to figure out strategies to work through this short-term issue. They're not eligible for that to participate with health insurance coverage unless they receive a diagnosis. So in that scenario, they would have to be diagnosed with something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or depression, or anxiety, receive the clinical diagnosis for insurance to cover that. Well, now we have if it's a work-related incident, we have work creating the requirement to have a work-related diagnosis for PTSD or some other item, when in fact they're trying to get short-term help to address that issue. So now we have, possibly workman's comp issues. We're in fact, the process itself necessitates their absence from work. And it really, the current system kind of precipitates issues in that individual's life when maybe they were looking for some coping strategies in between there. And so we've seen the gap and the effects of that service gap with our employees, both police and our general staff. And what we're recommending is that in addition to the annual mental health check-ins, that we also use the same service provider to provide confidential short-term individual therapy sessions, which would be optional for all city staff members, really as that gap between EAP and the long-term care. So the service provider that we're recommending was Marie Ridgway and Associates. And one of the things she specializes in is accelerated resolution therapy, which is really focused on limited sessions. And the type of therapy is really solution-oriented, teaching strategies for managing stress. And she shared that typically they can work through most issues in about 4 to 6 sessions. If that's not the case, then the employee would be referred to a kind of a long-term care or a therapeutic issue. Not everything is going to be resolved in 3 to 6 sessions. And this really isn't meant to take the place of a long-term therapeutic provider. What this is meant to do is mitigate the impacts that failing to effectively address those short or intermediate issues, which then frequently manifest themselves as long-term issues, both for the city and the employee. And based on our analysis and what we know and what we've learned, we believe that the city obviously would come out ahead not only in having healthier employees, but also financially with the time and energy with the staff and the HR and labor attorneys to work through a lot of these issues and trying to support our staff members. So I touched on kind of the big picture, and I don't know if Brad has anything he'd like to add, but I'd be happy to answer some questions. I was able to have some discussions with Councilmember Dejewski and Councilmember Bottom on how to try and address some of the questions that they had about this, but I'd be happy to take some more.
Mayor, and thanks Matt, great job walking through that. And just kind of elaborate further on what Matt brought up earlier. It's really having that nuanced tool to work with from an employer standpoint. Right now, for employers struggling with employees is struggling with something, we have basically 3 options. Keep working and deal with it. Or it's a work issue, so it's workers' comp, or it's your own personal issue, so it's short-term disability. And as Matt said, there's a lot of nuanced issues that through a little bit of help, people can be more productive at work and have less issues at home, which makes them, again, more productive at work. So I think for us it's twofold. One, having employees who are able to function in some high-stress environments. I think the police obviously is on its own at a certain level. I think right now with the pandemic and everything we're asking people, I think it's a nice opportunity to offer to everyone to see how it works for people. But then, as Matt alluded to or talked briefly, just the amount of time it takes, Jessica, for the most part, for navigating these complex environments related to workers' comp and short-term disability, that inevitably brings in myself, a supervisor, a city attorney, sometimes a labor attorney, because they're very technical in nature. And we would say, we have this resource, why don't you try it and see how it works for you? So I think it's a really good tool to toolbox. So that's all I have.
Okay, let's start with Councilmember Henderson for questions.
I was wondering, is the proposal is your ordinance for only full-time employees? What about our part-time police staff?
mandatory annual mental health check-ins for full-time police officers and the therapy sessions available for our full-time staff. And I think that for now, I think the thought behind that was that's the simplest way to start it, check the effectiveness, see how it's going. And I think if there was a common sense application for it with the part-time staff, for instance, a part-time police officer that's involved in an incident, we would probably make sure that we utilize the services on a case-by-case basis as needed for, the right thing to do on the employer behalf.
Good. Yeah, I think it's a wonderful idea. Just being a police officer with the crazy schedules, the huge amount of uncertainty every day when you go to work, to have this available is really the way to go. And to have a provider that has some credibility is absolutely what's needed. So I think this is a great start, a great first shot at a plan. I hope we can improve it. I hope it really works well.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a spot-on solution to a problem that is out there that needs to be resolved. This does it in a good way. I'm fully in support of it. Councilmember Schultz?
I think Tom asked one of my primary questions, but I was going to ask, there's no provisions in our current labor contract that covers any of this?
Correct.
Okay. And is the current proposal just for officers or for all city staff?
So the mandatory annual check-ins is only for the police officers, but the voluntary or optional therapy sessions would be available to all full-time staff with this proposal and included in that estimate. It worked out to approximately, so we based our estimations on what the provider said she typically sees from participations, which was about 20% of employees, which if we based it on 20% of our city employees, and if they haven't utilized all 6 sessions, it comes out to about $4,500 annually, and with the about $1,000 cost for the mandatory mental health check-ins, it comes out to about $20 per employee per month would be the cost of the city. So while the total cost of $5,500 is real money, I think it's made up quickly in dealing with one scenario where maybe an issue wasn't appropriately handled where it could have been.
And I fully understand and support the application to our law enforcement. I don't see that other positions in the city have the same stress levels as our law enforcement staff. I tend to shy away to having the same level of support for the rest of the city staff. Maybe not having the option up to 6 sessions, maybe something more limited, 2 to 3 sessions I could support, but not. I guess there's so many more options out in the public sector for people to go to if they need some type of emotional support that I don't know that the city or any employer has to provide all that to their staff. So I guess I would favor the current proposal for law enforcement and then up to 2 sessions per regular city staff per year.
Sure, and I can provide a little bit of background as to why we chose that. And that was really based on the provider obviously was selected to be an individual that's equipped to deal with both law enforcement and all of our resident or all of our staff members. So it's not just limited to law enforcement, but based on the type of treatment with the accelerated resolution therapy, where they really work through to try and resolve the issue, they said that typically that 3 to 5 sections is what it takes to work through that typical course of treatment in that accelerated resolution therapy. That's why she recommended going with the 6 sessions, but nearly all of the issues can be addressed within those 6 sessions, which is obviously not meant to take the place of the long-term therapy. And likewise, that was some of the challenges that we heard from even our non-law enforcement employees was the requirement to receive a diagnosis to receive long-term therapy to work through items. For instance, there's, when you get compounding issues that you have employees that are, when they're going through a divorce and the loss of a loved one at the same time, just learning some coping strategies for them was more effective trying to get there rather than trying to figure out which in-network provider they could get referred to get them their diagnosis, to talk to somebody for a handful of times. So yeah, I think that was at least the logic or the intent of it, and I can see your perspective as well.
Yeah, I understand that. I just think there's other options out in the public sector. I shouldn't say public sector, but there's other options to people other than just, employee assistance plans or benefit provided by employers. There's religious organizations, there's non-religious organizations that provide counseling to people. So that's just my take on it, and I'll let it go to someone else.
Okay. Councilman Dejewski?
Yeah, as I read through it, I was kind of surprised that there really wasn't this benefit already included in what's provided to our employees. So as I learned more about it, I think it makes even more sense that you don't need a diagnosis, and you can just, get some very targeted care. There's a variety of issues hitting us right now, so I'm fine with it and would recommend it.
Okay.
It's fairly low cost from a benefit perspective, in my view.
Councilman Roboto?
Yeah, Matt and I had pretty lengthy discussion today about, some of the things I think about, like, are there other options? We talked about the EAP and some of the problems with that. And there's some additional issues with the police department and the stresses that maybe regular counselors aren't versed in that are germane. I thought about the same thing that Brian did, or I think it's Brian, which was, or maybe Alan, other people maybe shouldn't have that kind of acute care because of the stress involved. And I asked Matt today, what if, like, one of our maintenance workers runs over someone with a road grader or something? I mean, there are different acute situations where something like this is who somebody should be talking to, because it's an incident related event rather than a medical condition per se. And so I guess I agree that this shouldn't be the go-to for, I don't want to say regular, because, if you're the person that has some things going on, they're big to you. I would want to make sure, and I don't know how we would decide for this, or maybe I will hope that people use it when it's appropriate, I guess. But I'm comfortable with it.
And I guess I certainly empathize with Councilmember Schultz's position on it, but my thinking is that it's rather difficult to find good providers out there. If we can provide our good counselors, if we can provide our staff with something that's efficient when they're in a state of needing help, for them to have to navigate the system, if we can eliminate that need and get them to someone who's qualified and we feel confident, I think it's worth the cost. So I would support the presentation. Any other comments?
I think John's comment, I understand a little bit more when John said incident-related event. The example of someone running over someone with a grader, or some traumatic event that happens when you're on the job, right? But if it's just normal, you had an argument at home something like that. I don't know, but I'm not gonna dive down on the sword, so that, whatever.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I'll entertain a motion to direct staff, the mayor and staff to enter into the attached wellness program service agreement with Marine Ridgeway to provide annual mandatory police officer mental health check-ins and optional short-term mental health services for all city staff.
So moved, Kajewski.
Second, Anderson.
Any further discussion? All in favor, Thomas, aye. Anderson,
Aye.
Ottoman,
Aye.
Kajewski,
Aye.
and Schultz.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're on to staff reports, item 11A, which is the pandemic response update.
I'll turn it over to Matt first.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. As of today, the United States officially over 500,000 COVID cases. As you already know, we are in a declared state of emergency in the United States, in the state of Minnesota, Hennepin County, and in the city of Corcoran. In Minnesota, we've reached about 1,650 cases. I think right now they're still anticipating the peak in Minnesota to be in mid to late July, which is harder to fathom when you look at where we're at now and thinking that's still that far out. But it's, as they said, a few weeks ago, that this is really a marathon and not a sprint. And if that doesn't drive the point home, I don't know what does. Good and bad news. The good news is I think that today was the first date between yesterday and today where we had a new date without a new death. However, we did see a triple-digit increase in cases in the state. But more concerning is that it is confirmed in over 85 congregate care facilities. And once it started hitting the congregate care facilities, that's when it really started taking off in a lot of the other jurisdictions. So as you heard and seen a lot about the peak, over the last several weeks, that's really kind of the start of the basis. Once it starts infiltrating the congregate care facilities, you start seeing the cases rise more rapidly in those confined spaces. And I know some of the discussion today focused around some of the high-rise buildings and how do they help contain the spread once you get into a facility, say, like a Cedar Riverside or other large apartment complexes. And once it starts beginning in some of those more confined areas, they do see the growth a little bit more rapidly. Hennepin County has the most cases currently in the state. We're at about 557 cases as of today. But I guess if there is positive news, we have relatively